Welcome to the On Purpose podcast, where together we will learn from personal stories and explore thought-provoking topics, all with one goal in mind: living a more purposeful life. Welcome to this week's episode of the On Purpose podcast. It's always a pleasure and a privilege to be here with you, and I am excited for our guest this week. This is a repayment of a debt he owed me, which I called in. Sometimes I don't call these in, but this guy wanted to bring on a show. We first met when I went on his show, the On the Blue Line podcast, which is a law enforcement-based show that's interested in creating wellness and whole wellness around law enforcement officers in that profession through mental health, physical health, and just open discussion. But I thought he had a lot to offer our community as well, so I wanted to bring him on our show. And this week you get to hear from him. But before I tell you who it is and some of the things we're going to talk about, I want to thank our Patreon members out there whose financial contributions continue to help us grow our purposeful community around the world. So if you're interested in helping in that manner, please join us at patreon.com/the On Purpose podcast, where you'll find membership options available for all budgets. And you could have the self-satisfaction and joy of knowing your monthly financial contribution goes to brightening somebody's day somewhere around the world through our purposeful content. All right, this week we sit down and we interview Wayne Mulder. He's a former landscaper, current police officer down in Florida who has his own podcast and has basically committed his life to being somebody that makes others better around him, right? He lives his life through a quote of Zig Zigler: "You can have everything in life you want if you just help enough people get what they want." So to hear more on that, I hope you enjoy the interview with Wayne Mulder. Welcome to the show, Wayne. I'm excited to flip the tables on you, my friend.
It is truly a privilege. Thanks for inviting me back, Jared. This is going to be a lot of fun. I think we're going to have a great conversation.
Yeah, I'm excited. For those of you that haven't heard yet, I was on Wayne's podcast, On the Blue Line podcast, before this, and then kind of called in a favor and brought him over here because I think he has some fantastic insights and perspective that will greatly benefit the On Purpose community. So, Wayne, it is our pleasure to have you, my friend.
Thank you.
Wayne, do me a favor. Tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of what led you to even having a podcast.
Absolutely. Well, honestly, I'm just a Midwest boy who put plants in the ground green side up most of my life. And then at one point, about 11 years ago, I had a change of career, and that brought me to the law enforcement career, which is something that I've really had a privilege being able to serve both the community and the people I've gotten to work with, which we'll talk more about. And in 2019, after spending time in the law enforcement career, I love podcast medium. I loved hearing, the stories and people working, much like the On Purpose podcast community. I just love that group of people working together for the betterment of everyone within it. And so that whole community idea led me to wanting to start my podcast, the On the Blue Line podcast. And then from there, in the beginning, I wasn't really sure. I just felt like it was something I ought to do. And then my why kind of came when we lost a fellow officer to suicide. And I really realized that impact that podcasts such as yours and mine can have for the officers out there listening. So it's been fun. It's been a journey. It's been a learning experience, but I've enjoyed both equally, both working in law enforcement and the podcast opportunity.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah, and you never know what story is going to resonate with anybody or find them at just the moment they needed it in their lives.
Absolutely.
But what we do know is if we don't share the story, nobody can find it.
So true.
Right.
The medium to me, it just reminds me of like the old sitting around a campfire, those meaningful conversations you used to have with friends and buddies. And I mean, some of those moments in life were the most meaningful and maybe in some ways the most life-changing. And that's what I love about the podcast medium. It just feels like it's, two individuals sitting here just having conversation that, like you said, someone else can listen in, and that one thing they hear might make a big difference in their life or in the lives that they touch. So
Absolutely.
it really can keep going.
No, I love it. And I always have this image in my head that growing up, television became big for us. And we would see like old pictures or cartoons of like the family in the 40s and 50s huddled around the radio, listening to a radio broadcast. And I kind of think like maybe in 40 or 50 years, people will look at like you and I talking on this podcast and be like, oh, look how old they were sitting there talking to each other on a computer.
You're probably right. By then, if Elon Musk gets his way, we may have implants that will be talking to each other on. But
hey, all right. Well, I know some people on to bash Elon, others love him. I will tell you, I do have Starlink.
Yep.
And it has been amazing for the lifestyle we're living as far as being able to get connected in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah. Oh, I love a lot of the projects. Some of them scare me a little bit, such as neuro implants. Yes. But I think that's to be expected with any changing technology. But you're right. It is such a gift. And I know we talked about it before, but just what you're able to do with Starlink. And of course, with my future dreams and plans, it's I'm happy to know it's out there for when that day comes to fruition.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think Elon is really the Iron Man in real life.
I've heard that before. Definitely a Tony Stark-esque figure. That is for sure.
I just hope he stays on the side of good.
That is the problem with technology. We're seeing that right now. It's like, as long as it's being used for good, we are great. But if that day comes where it's no longer used for good, we may make a different footnote in history, unlike anything the world has ever seen.
For sure. All right, let's get you warmed up, Wayne. I appreciate the intro. But I like a certain structure. I like to make sure our audience really gets to know the deep down inside type secrets of Wayne. So we're going to get you warmed up, my friend. Here you go. First warm-up question for you. You're stranded on a deserted island for the rest of your life, and you get one food. What would Midwestern, now Floridian Wayne take with him?
I would have to say Chicago-style pizza. It's just hands down. I mean, because we're not talking health here. We need the calorie dense food to survive this island. Yeah. So I would say I still echo the Midwestern roots. And if it's not meat and potatoes, then it's got to be a Chicago style pizza.
You're going deep dish still, huh? All that carbs and the crust and everything.
So we had a pizza place out of Indiana, northern Indiana, where I'm from, called Oli's Pizza. And yeah, it was a Chicago deep dish style, and they made the 10-pounder. So one year for my birthday, I was like, Dad, that is what I want, is the 10-pounder. So yeah, sure enough, he bought that thing. And yeah, it was the 2-crust, cheese on top of that thing, everything you can imagine. It was the works, and the whole thing weighed like 10 pounds. So
I tell you what, man, you would definitely have plenty of carbs for energy on your island with that.
You can survive the island with that Oli's 10-pounder. Yes, you can.
I love it. All right. When you get one superpower, what would your superpower be, and why would you want to have it?
That is a good question. And there's probably a lot of better answers than what I'll come up with. But off the cuff, I would say like flying, because I love to travel. So having the ability to go to other places, to meet people, we just talked about how I just got back from Colorado. So the ability to move from one location to another swiftly would certainly be something I would enjoy, because I would be able to do more, see more, and meet more people that way.
Yeah, that's true. You'd control the old schedule.
Oh, yes. Something very difficult to do.
Oh, man. That's my biggest pet peeve with flying, is I feel like I just spend so much idle time being on somebody else's schedule.
Yes.
All right. Favorite book, Wayne?
So I have a lot of favorite books. Genre?
Whatever.
All right. Well, if it's
let's change. All right. You're needing a little bit of purpose today. You wake up, you got a case of the blues. What book are you going to pick up that you're like, you know what, this gives me perspective, I'm back?
One of my favorites right now, and I had him on my podcast, full disclosure, but I really like Relentless Courage with Michael Segru. And what I love about that book, especially for law enforcement officers, is that he wrote it with Doc Springer.
Oh yeah.
So you get a doctor's perspective at the end of every chapter while he's talking about his story. And that book was so, so powerful for me because you would read like his thoughts and, incidents that he would describe that he was in that anyone in law enforcement would, it will take you back to moments that you've had that have been very similar. And then she would offer immediately the doctor's perspective to the feelings and thoughts that he was going through.
Oh
And
wow.
that to me was powerful and probably one of the best books when it comes to a nonfiction helpful book for law enforcement officers. Now, in the fiction genre, if I may, I love the book A Land Remembered by Patrick Smith. So that is probably one of my favorite books. And that is for a history buff who wants a fictional account of what Florida was like in the quote good old days. So it really tracks a
Okay.
fictional account of cracker cowboys, which is what they were called in Florida, or
Yeah.
cracker cowmen, when the state was actually more cows and less about the beaches.
Yeah. Super interesting. I will tell you on a side note, the first few times we went to Florida, I was shocked at the amount of cattle and horses that people still own there. I had no idea Florida
Yeah.
had a cowboy culture.
And a lot of people have no idea that there is what they call cracker cattle and cracker horses that are descendants of the original Spanish herds that
Right.
came over through St. Augustine.
Yeah. No,
So
that's amazing. All right. When you get to have dinner with one person, either they can still be with us or may have passed away, who would you have dinner with and what specifically would you ask them?
these are great questions, by the way.
Thanks, man.
I would say if I could pick one person going fairly modern, obviously, there's, as a man of faith, people might say Jesus or others, and those are obviously really great answers for a lot of good reasons. But picking someone from more contemporary history who is no longer with us, I would say John Adams. And I would love to have a conversation with John Adams as far as his vision for America. And really, when you look at the times we are in, I would love to go back to those original framers of both the Declaration and the Constitution and have that kind of conversation. So,
All right. What do you think? Best guess. What do you think the founding fathers would say right now watching us?
well, John Adams specifically, being the one who said that our system of government is for a moral and religious people, might say that we have gone off track and that our constitutional system is definitely fraught. What I like about him, you got to remember, this is a guy, when it comes to John Adams, who defended the British. He's when you had the shooting there, he's the one that said facts are stubborn things and actually defended them when the whole shooting there in Boston took place. So
Right.
that's what I like about him is he doesn't seem to be somebody who's like, hey, this is the only way. But I think going back and looking at our current system where we're falling further and further kind of away from the original intent, I could certainly see him saying, you guys are missing the mark here. Let's go back to these original documents and read this again.
Yeah, it's amazing to me, quite honestly, how long ago those documents were written
Yeah.
and how applicable they still are today if we take the time to read and try to understand what is the words written then, what do they actually mean now?
Yeah.
Instead of just trying to dismiss things.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I can be a little bit of an absolutist with things. So I understand that some people aren't, and some people think, things can change. And
Yeah.
there's certainly an argument to be had for that. But you're so right. I mean, sometimes if you just go back to that, we can apply it to the world we're in today. And I really do think it's interesting in law enforcement, right? You have to have a foundational principle, right? There has to be law, and this is the way we do it. And the further we get away from that and everything becoming subjective, and Jared has his own ideas of how the world should be, and Wayne has his own ideas. There's a place to meet in the middle as long as we have something that is true that we can both agree on. But if we have nothing that we agree on, and there is nothing that we both agree is true or accurate, or the founding principle or the guiding principle, I guess is a better way to put it in this analogy, then we just get further and further from being able to find any middle ground, because we really do end up in these little echo chambers of, you're going to do your thing, I'm going to do my thing, and we've got nothing bringing us together. And that was the whole principle of e pluribus unum, right? Out of many, one. That is the guiding principle here, is that at the end of the day, we have to have something that brings us together. So
Yeah, that's fascinating to me. Not only something that we can agree on that brings us together as community, but I would even say most of us, Wayne, nowadays, we don't even know what we agree on internally for ourselves.
ooh.
Right. So, like, how can I possibly show up for you if I don't even know who I am anymore? I am so influenced by everything going on around me. And that's actually the episode the week before yours is talking about knowing your value and assigning your value and taking the power of creating your value.
Yeah.
Right. Like, society doesn't, likes and followers and stuff doesn't get to make me decide if I feel good about myself. I can decide that. I take ownership of how do I feel about me first, because once I create that framework for me and I put myself on good standing with myself, now I'm of service to you, Wayne.
Absolutely. And taking it a step further, I think we have so many times, and I see this, a lot of times with even like newer officers or just people in general, where we don't even know why we believe what we believe or what we believe, like you said. And I think that is such a strong place to start, because if you don't know that, or like you said, you're easily, and sometimes you can be easily influenced by other things if you don't know what you believe.
Right.
And that's such a starting point that for so many people, and I know it seems intuitive, but it's kind of revolutionary for the times we're in. Because if you really get down to, well, why is that true? Or why do you believe that? Or why do you say that? It's the old story of, well, it's the way we've always done it. And rather than having something that's grounded in the why you actually do what you do.
Right. And we talked about this on your show, the need to develop critical thinking in police officers. Right. Like, as a police officer trainer, I don't want robots. I don't want students to just do what they do because I told them to do it and they don't know why.
Yeah.
But I also don't want that for society. I don't want kids coming through a school system where they're believing something because somebody told them to believe it, but they don't know why.
Yeah.
Right. And that's where I think we got to go back to a little bit and it starts with our families and our parenting and society in general, is we got to develop people that think for themselves. And then in order to do that, we got to have grace for one another. Yes. Right? Because I know this, Wayne, you and I can go through the exact same incident as police officers or just citizens in life. And we can have completely different truths of that incident. Yeah. Based on our life experience, the lens we're looking through, our past history, our mood at the time. And the beautiful thing is we can both be right, even though we have different truths.
So true. So true. And I do think that's a great example of pointing out in law enforcement, because you see it when you do debriefs of any sort on any major incident, or even looking at the reports. If you and I wrote a report on the same incident that we were out there for 6 hours on this case, you and I are both going to see things differently, write things differently. Now, the basic fact pattern is going to be the same. The guy did X, did whatever, and we responded in such way. But the way you responded, the way I responded, and the way we saw the event is all going to be unique to our own perspectives. And I think that's good. Like, we don't want, sometimes when someone talks like I do, and you say something like, well, I'm kind of an absolutist about things or so forth, well, then immediately people jump to, well, it's a cookie cutter. You want everyone to be exactly the same. For the love of God, I don't want everyone to be the same. You don't want a whole bunch of wings, you want those different perspectives. It's just that we have some basic grounding principles that bring us together. And that's what I find to be important, no matter which of these areas. And I think the times we are in, you had that great poem that you had heard from the Aubrey Marcus podcast, The Unburied Life. And that's so powerful. And I think that's it's amazing how here's something written in the 1800s and it's just as applicable today as it was back then.
Absolutely. If we can check our egos in today's age and we realize we are not the epitome of the human process already, and we give some grace to people that maybe didn't know what we know beforehand because we're looking back with 2020 hindsight, and
Yeah.
just take something that was written and go, wait a second, this has merit still.
Yeah.
Right. And I
I
think
love your use of the word grace. I really think that is the right word. And it's something that's so, among other words, forgiveness and so
yeah,
forth, that are missing today. But I think grace is definitely one that we're seeing. The entire premise of what's being termed cancel culture really is moving away from grace and moving away
absolutely.
from this. People are going to make mistakes and we're going to forgive them. Maybe not forget in the sense that it never happened, but be like, if somebody's truly willing to make a change, then that's where grace comes in.
Absolutely. And not only that, but I think it goes both ways. We can talk on this for a second is if I can't give you grace and I can't give people that I never met 100 years ago grace for what they may or may not have known or for things that might have been right or wrong, there's a good chance I don't give myself any grace either.
Yeah.
And that I'm beating myself up and I'm carrying baggage I no longer need to carry baggage for. And that is where our depression comes in, our mental health issues, our lack of compassion for other humans comes together is when I can't give myself grace.
Yeah.
And I walk around all day beating myself up or carrying this big backpack full of rocks of past mistakes instead of going, hey, dude, you're imperfect.
Yep. Forgiving ourselves can be one of the hardest things for us
Absolutely.
to do.
Especially, you focus really on the law enforcement community, and that's one of the huge ones, right?
Yeah.
Is allowing people to grow within that career field
Yes.
and not labeling somebody for the mistake they made as a brand new rookie that sticks with them for 20 years.
That's true. That is a great application of what we're talking about here, because you're right. And I think there is a within reason, right? So there are things that we do
Yeah.
that are clearly wrong, or life-changing decisions that it's like, okay, that's clearly outside. But you are right. There's so much of area where it's part of the learning process. And if we would just give people the ability sometimes to even make mistakes, because we want to, we talk a lot about this in the mental health side of this law enforcement conversations, like what you have and I have, is that some of it is that we expect people to be perfect. And in the moment that they show any signs of weakness or struggling or anything like that, what we do is we immediately discard them. And so everything that we say we believe as far as trying to get them help and trying to walk with them through this time that they're going through, we do directly the opposite, both at the agency level, the supervisor level, sometimes as fellow officers or deputies, and we just discard them. And then that creates a bigger tailspin or a bigger spiral within their life. And we've seen the effects of where that leads.
And I would even add, Wayne, that I 100% agree. And for those of our community that aren't in law enforcement, I think this applies to life in general, whether it's family members, whether it's relationships. I mean, I will even tie it to parenting. If your children don't feel they have the space to make a mistake and still receive love, to make a mistake and still be safe within the confines of their home, if they're being raised to avoid pain at all costs, to avoid stumbles at all costs, we're creating an unfair reality expectation for them.
Yes. And I would say, continuing that thought, that it's not only an unfair expectation and one that they're not going to reach, but they also lose the educational benefits. I mean, looking back over my life and over some of the struggles and stuff I'd mentioned that I had worked in landscaping, or I'd said I put plants on the ground, green side up. It's kind of the same. But I had done that for years prior to this. And I lost that business, and it was and I lost it for not necessarily my own. I mean, they were lessons that I learned, but there were some outside factors that played a part in it. And then, of course, we went through the housing crisis that affected the whole nation, and that played a part in it as well. But the lessons that I learned through that and other things that I've gone through in my life, I wouldn't be the person I am today, able to do the things I can do today, if it wasn't for some of those lessons I learned by things not going well or mistakes that I've made.
Give me an example. Give me a couple, share with our community a couple things you lost or that you learned by what we'd say failing at a business that you could not have learned by skipping the failure process.
Well, for me with the business, it was a few things. So my growing up, that I was very passive with things, and very in fact, law enforcement was really good for me from the standpoint that it taught me to be less passive, to stand up, to be more vocal, in some ways maybe less trusting, but that is in and of itself not necessarily a problem as long as it doesn't, go past a certain line. And in business, being from the Midwest, I certainly was very trusting. And in one situation that kind of became the beginning of the end is I pretty much had a handshake deal with a customer in northern Indiana that decided not to pay over $100,000. And so that kind of created the beginning of the end. But through that process, what I really found about myself is I was very passive about things. There were things I could have done as far as standing up, speaking, a lot of the things that didn't become part of my personality or part of my way of life until I came to law enforcement and really learned the strength of being willing to stand up and face adversity rather than defaulting to wanting to hide from it. Right? Because the default is like when your phone is ringing and things are going really poorly and your business is going into the toilet, you have a tendency, a natural default is, well, I don't want to deal with it. I don't want to be on the phone. I don't want to be the guy standing there talking to these people. You want to hide. That's the natural default. And one of the strong lessons that I learned in life that has done well for me since is learning that no, when adversity comes, when things aren't going the way they should, you've got to stand up and face that head on. And that's a lesson I kind of learned through law enforcement, but it's a life lesson I learned from losing a business as well.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. What about the pain there? What would you say was the one pain that stuck with you that you're like, okay, I'm going to be different because I don't want to feel that again?
Well, I think with pain, so that's a good question. And there's a few different ways to take that, right? I think for me, and maybe just speaking as myself, but one of the worst parts for me was the feeling that I'm a failure.
Yeah.
And I think we all end up there at one time or another. And it kind of comes down to what you were saying earlier, when you got to show yourself grace and be forgiving and be willing to acknowledge that we all make mistakes. But I think that was a huge part of it, is the feeling of failing, especially since I've been very fortunate in my life that a lot of things that I did worked out and they went well. And I've had, I was very fortunate with a lot of things. So in that was probably the number one quote unquote scary thing for me, was that feeling of, hey, you're a failure. And what happens is, and you hit on this earlier, and it doesn't matter if you're in law enforcement or whatever your career is, you start beating yourself up and you start compounding what, it's like, none of it's true. You're making agreements with something that isn't true. You start calling yourself a failure, and then next thing you know, you start acting like one. So there was that. And then there was also, I was also a young father, married. And so there was that hardship as well of going through, what I saw, how it was affecting family. It had a lot to do with my move to the state of Florida, because I was trying to save the business. And in Florida, you can put plants on the ground green side up year round.
Right.
So there was a lot of things there that I wanted to try to do to salvage it. But I think for me, the hardest part was just being willing to accept that, hey, we make mistakes. Hey, we can face adversity head on, and then take these experiences and be like, okay, I can do better next time, and be willing to start again. That was another lesson that took me a long time, maybe too long to get to, because for years I was like, well, I'm just never going to do a business again, never going to put myself out there, because maybe it was a little bit of gun shyness, if you would, from having gone through that. But it just felt like, hey, if I put myself out there again, then I could fail again. Right. And
Yeah.
that is that cycle that you don't want to be in.
No, I love it. And that's you hit it on the head there. And I love what you said. You were feeling like a failure and you were talking to yourself as a failure. And you got to move past that, right? Like
Yeah,
failing is part of learning. Coming up short is just as important, if not more important than winning.
absolutely.
Right. And that's one of the things I challenge our parents out there and our leaders, our supervisors, whatever career field you're in, is do the people that look up to you, do the people that report to you, do they have room to fail and make mistakes under you and feel that pain? Right. Or are we the proverbial safety blanket and we wrap everybody up in this insulated, nice, warm, fuzzy place where they don't feel any pain and they don't make mistakes out of our desire to protect them? But what we're actually doing is shortchanging the learning process. We're stunting their growth.
Yep.
Right. And I love that you failed, and then you had the courage to go again.
Yeah. And that is so important. I love what you said there because I really see it with children. And when I say children, the next generation, my son's 20 years old. So I'm using
Okay.
that
Yeah.
that word very loosely when I say children. But
Yeah.
I see that with his age group and even young deputies and officers coming into this career is you have to accept that you're going to make mistakes and that you're going to fail. Know why you do what you do, which will help keep you on the course and help you make good decisions. But then also, like you said, should have that grace not only with yourself, but with those around you. And I think what you do there, and I'm kind of thinking this through as we talk, but I think what you do, like that is the basis for community, which is a lot of what you talk about
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of what the On Purpose podcast is all about. It really, you draw in the strength of the community when you have a bunch of people who are willing to accept the reality that we're all human, we're all going to make mistakes, but working together, we can be stronger for it.
And quite honestly, the best stories, the stories we learn the most from, start with struggle, right? Like think
Every
about the
time.
movies. What are the best movies out there? It's always somebody that faces a huge adversity and overcomes it.
Yep.
Right. We want to pay money to watch Hollywood tell us about the story, but then we want to pretend it doesn't exist in our own world.
Yeah.
Right.
Where
We
does
want
that
to go ahead.
come from though, Jared? Where does that come from in your opinion? Is it just because I find it interesting because in my feeling, it feels like it's changed in the last 20 years. So where does it come from? Is it just we've become a society where we really believe we can control everything? We're so technologically advanced that we think we can control everything, including human behavior? Or
I mean, I think that could be part of it. Here's where I go to is the biggest difference between my generation. I'm a little older than you, but we're fairly close. Our generation growing up and the kids today is I could go out and do dumb stuff. I could make
yes,
a mistake. And it didn't necessarily mean the cops had to get called and charges had to be pressed and I had to be a criminal, right? Like parents would walk you home and be like, they'd have you by the ear and be like, hey, this kid was stealing apples from my tree. And mom and dad say, I'll take care of it. And we were done.
yep,
Today, though, when kids make mistakes, and here's where I think we've done them a disservice. You do something stupid. Well, you got to live with it for a long time because there's 8 kids with cell phones that are filming it and putting it viral and tagging you. So now everybody sees it, right? Like technology is great. And I love, like, we're doing a podcast now that's going to reach people around the world.
yeah,
Fantastic. But I think for kids today, there's just such a dramatic, they don't want to make mistakes. They don't want anybody to film it. They don't want to have to face repercussions because they can't get away from it.
yeah.
Right.
I
Well,
think
we
you're
had
absolutely right.
escapes. Like I could take the bus home from school, get to my neighborhood. Nobody in my neighborhood knew what kind of dumb shit I did at school, or vice versa. Whereas today, they literally can't get away. And I think we've just really dropped the ball on that for them, and that we haven't taught good balance. That what you see on your phone, what you see, isn't real world.
Yeah.
What you feel is real world, and the people around you are real world. And I think we're just so imbalanced there that it makes kids gun shy to to truly be themselves.
Yeah. And I think it feeds into, like you said, acceptance and some of these other things as well, which is why there's a fear of being themselves. Because am I going to be accepted as this? If I don't do exactly what my friends are expecting, or, whatever it is in that social community, a lot of times, and not even the real world,
Yeah.
then they feel like, well, if I do something different, then I'm going to be shunned or whatever. And I don't, rather than being an individual, I want to be part of this collective.
Well, and you think about it now, the kids now are growing up from the minute they're born, there's social media, right?
Yeah.
Like I was actually last winter, we were at dinner in Florida and real nice restaurant. We hit happy hour because you can save some money and eat early. Yeah, I'm getting old, but we eat dinner early down there. And there's this family next to us, and it's grandma and grandpa, and maybe aunt and uncle, and a new mom and her baby. And her baby's cute. Like, I mean, pretty much all babies are born cute. It's hard not to have a cute baby, but there's nothing special about this baby. We don't know that this baby is the baby of all babies. And she has a little bow in her hair, and she's beautiful. And, they're right next to us. We can hear the conversation, sort of, interacting. We're like, hey, your baby's beautiful. How old is she? And she's like, oh, she's 6 months. You could follow her on Instagram right here. And I'm like, what? What did I just hear? Right? You know what I mean? Like literally the kids are being born. And I don't think it's the kids' fault. I think it's the parents' fault, right? If social media comes in, we didn't teach good boundaries.
Yeah.
Because we bought into it ourselves, right? We got addicted to Facebook. We got addicted to likes and thumbs up and follows and comments. So then they're being taught that this cyber world, this other world that we can't see and touch, is more important than all the real stuff right around them.
Yep. And I like how you pointed out that I think sometimes we make us older people, if I may, you and I, we make these broad statements. Our generation does, and we're like, oh well, it's these younger people, with Instagram accounts or whatever for their 6-month-old. But I like how you pointed out we do the same darn thing, and how we need to look. It kind of goes back to how we started this whole conversation. We have to be introspective first. If we're not willing to look inside and peel through those layers and ask ourselves hard questions and take those considerations, because I think taking all of this to the next level, because I always like to end with, like how do we change things? Well, you change them one person at a time, and that all starts with that introspective process, and then moving from there to the community. It's these type conversations, two guys having a talk, and then looking inward and being like, well, maybe I ought to make a couple changes here.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. Nothing changes unless we change. But one of my biggest pet peeves, and then we'll move on, is when I hear parents or grandparents complain about the next generation. And I want to be like, wait a second. Oh, you don't agree with participation trophies? Great. Me neither. Well, then who created them? Oh, that's right. We did. We allowed this to happen, right? Like kids don't grow up. They don't come out and go, hey, mom, dad, I want to be weaker than the previous generation. Right? They don't know what they don't know. Parents create the world. Just like if we want subordinates at work that are creative thinkers and that problem solve and that will come to us with solutions instead of just identifying problems. Well, we got to make sure they know that's okay. That it's an option. Right? Like we can't sit back and go, oh, kids of today, they don't know what they don't know. Right? No, that means you dropped the ball, my friend. We dropped the ball here.
I could not agree with you more. In fact, I was recently in a leadership class. It was the FBI LEADA class that a lot of guys have taken. And we were discussing generational differences in law enforcement as the baby boomer generation moves out, and, generation X and Y and so forth. And it's true that no matter what issue you're talking about, you literally can go back, because the same people who are saying, I can't believe these kids today, which is, been said for hundreds of years, if not longer, forever, are you look back and you're like, well, if your generation wouldn't have done this, then we wouldn't be here today doing this, and you can do this going all the way back from the baby boomers, greatest generation. I mean, all the way back, antebellum generation, you're
Right.
like, what are you guys doing? If some of the decisions, Woodrow Wilson and, FDR and so forth, the things people complain about today started way back then. So,
Well, it's such a weird oxymoron, right? Like this new generation is just so much different. Well, isn't that what we want? Like, think about it. If all of us would have stayed the exact same, that is not evolutionary.
correct.
Right. So like it's weird that we want to bash the next generation for being different than us, but we don't want to take any accountability in the differences, nor do we want to sit back and go, hey, wait a second, I want to watch how this plays out. Right. Because maybe they are onto something. Maybe as a baby boomer, which isn't my generation, but maybe as a baby boomer, we were wrong. We shouldn't have worked 60 to 70 hours a week to save up for retirement. And then I see all my buddies dying before they do any of it. Maybe these young kids that want to work seasonal jobs 20 hours a week because they love snowboarding and raft guiding and whatever they're doing, but they seem happy. Maybe they got it right.
Yep. I think anytime you take in the general sense of the word, anytime you find yourself saying an all or nothing kind of mentality, that you're going to end up in the wrong spot, because we can all learn something from somebody else. There's kids out there today that absolutely can teach me something that's going to make me a better person now and in the future. And hopefully there's things that I can teach them that may do the same. And that is how it's supposed to work. That is why for eons before modern society, these large collective groups live together, and you had all these generations in one group, and that way they were learning from their grandparents in real time and learning from their parents and so forth, and that really helped educate them and give them kind of a broader perspective instead of this these kids today kind of mentality.
Dude, I love that. And that's so true. And that's why, you and I talked off air about travel and Wyoming and stuff like that. That's why, to me, it's imperative that you have to travel, right? Like we spent a month last year in Costa Rica, and the Costa Ricans have far less tangible material goods than us. Their quality of life, if you will, is at a much lesser degree than what we're used to in the United States, but their happiness is off the charts. Yeah. Because they have family, they have community, they're all working together, they're growing their own food. Like they understand the tie-in between their nature and their lives. Right. And I look here and I'm like, okay, so we have the most comfortable generation ever. We have everything we want material wise. We have technology and food, and you can go to any grocery store, it's always stocked. But we don't have happiness.
Yep.
Right. And I think it goes back to what you were saying there is we got to choose that for ourselves. Right. Instead of saying, oh, these kids today don't get it, they say, wait a second, this kid thinks differently, and maybe I should learn from him. Who cares that he's a teenager? Who cares that he's in his early 20s? Learn. And then shockingly, if you open that door to learn from them, they might actually put down their barriers and learn from you.
Absolutely, they will. Yeah, and I think the further we move away from, natural cycles, and I know you had mentioned that poem you had heard on the Aubrey Marcus podcast, but, the further we move away from the earth and the cycles and just living with nature and being introspective, and, the more we try to move away from these cycles of just kind of the way the world is, the more unhappier we become. Because we're trying to control something we were never meant to control in the first 100%. Place.
I was just going to say, we're trying to control Mother Nature when we are, in fact, part of it.
Yeah.
Right. And honestly, that's why I love this lifestyle, full-time travel in my camper. Like, I literally live nature all day long. Like, as soon as if I walked outside right now, there's nobody around us for a couple miles, and it's just us and nature. And I think that is something that we're definitely missing. We got to get back in tune with nature.
Couldn't agree with you more.
So let's talk. You sent me a quote, Wayne, Zig Ziglar's quote, you can have everything in life you want if you just help enough people get what they want. When
Yes.
did you find that quote and how has that kind of been a guiding principle for you?
So my dad, actually, when I was young preteen, of course, as a young preteen, I didn't want to listen to the stuff my dad listened to, but but that changes with life, as we all know.
Right.
But as a preteen, he listened to a lot of. I remember he had a copy of Zig Ziglar's Top Performance book, and he had a lot of different books and tapes by Zig Ziglar and other speakers. So I was quite young when I came into hearing that quote, you can have everything in life you want if you just help enough other people get what they want. And it became kind of the mission of the Ziglar Corporation. So it's something that if you follow any of what Zig was doing or what his son now does, it's constantly repeated. So I was young when I was in my early 20s. I'd been working in landscaping pretty much since I was old enough to push a lawnmower and clean up yards. So I'd been doing it all through my teenage years. And then in my early 20s, I finally started my own business that was more of an official company, and we were designing outdoor living environments. So it was all design build, and it was getting large enough to hire people. And so I really grew up. One of my favorite books before he was a president or anything, but The Art of the Deal. So I'd kind of grown up with this business mindset of really, wanting to be a businessman is what I wanted to do. So this quote, once it had been introduced to me and I got older to where you start saying, hey, dad really has it together, and no longer thinking I don't want anything that dad had to do with, became a driving force. It was a quote I had on the walls of my business, and then something years later when I came into law enforcement that I to this day have had on every desk that I've had in law enforcement, including in my vehicle when I didn't have a desk. What it means to me, the power of it is I think it focuses, and there's other ways now, like there's the current moniker, servant leadership is really big, which is good, and it has a similar connotation, but it really focuses to much of what we've been talking about, that the real focus of life has to be other centered. If you are only worried about yourself and your own success and your own, first of all, you're probably going to fail.
Yeah.
And secondly, you're going to be miserable because we weren't meant to live that way. We were meant to live in community. We were meant to be stronger together. So to me, that quote really draws home the point that if you're in any level of leadership, if you have been given the gift or the ability to run a business, to be a manager, or even when you're not, even when you're the guy that's just cleaning the floors, you still, if I help enough other people get what they want, if your success, Jared, becomes my driving mission, then your success will either, it can make me a better person. Who knows the relationships and the things that you and I then can do together, or the doors that it may open. And I mean, time and time again in my life, it's just been a powerful force. So it's probably one of my favorite quotes. And it's definitely what I would say is kind of the basis of my life mission.
No, I love it. That's such a good breakdown of that quote. And then you're putting it into practice with the On the Blue Line podcast now, and your commitment there to the whole well-roundedness of our law enforcement professionals and the other audience that just joined you to learn lessons of life that you're sharing there. So how's that been going for you? And what are your big takeaways since you started the podcast back in 2019?
Yeah, for me, and you kind of mentioned it there, when I first started, it had mental health undertones.
Yeah.
Because like I said, I'd lost a fellow deputy to suicide. And since then, our agency has actually lost 2 officers to suicide. And so there is definitely a mental health component to what I'm doing. But what I began to realize, and really became kind of what On the Blue Line is all about, is taking more of the approach of total health and wellness, because it's really in line with a lot of what we've been talking about. You are not only a mental being, you're not only a spiritual being, you're not only a physical being, and on it goes. And what I started seeing in my own life is the worse my physical health would get, the worse my mental health would get.
Yeah.
And the better my physical health would get, the better my mental health would be. And the same was true in the spiritual arena. And because we are total holistic, if you would,
Yep.
beings. So that was really the focus of what the podcast was. As far as through the process, I think that's been one of the big lessons. The other big lesson that is just maybe off topic a little bit is just the fact that you never know who is listening. And we kind of touched on this early on as well, but it's really been a privilege I was in training not long ago and had someone come up to me that I'm not even 100% sure who he is, and shook my hand and said, "Hey, I've been listening to your podcast. I love what you're doing and so forth." And it really resonated with me that you never know who's listening. And like you said, where they may be in life and what little thing you might say that really can make a difference. And again, the more people you help, and it's not about quote unquote helping yourself, but the more people you help, you have that benefit of feeling like, hey, I'm fulfilling what I was put here on this planet to do at this moment in time. And that to me is probably one of the more important things, is that I'm doing, to at least the best of my ability, what I was put here to do for such a time as this.
No, fantastic. How did you decide to put yourself out there? How did you decide that, you know what, I have a story to share and I have the courage to create this without knowing how many people would ever find me? How did you find that?
So for me, it was more just coming into listening to, I listened to Order of Man a lot, Ryan Mickler,
Yep.
and I loved what he was doing in the masculinity space for men. And I was a big fan of the show, listening to it quite a bit in late 2018. Before that, I couldn't even told you what a podcast was.
Sure.
I was like, and I'd never, even at that point, I didn't have an iPhone. So I had no idea what an Apple podcast was. That just wasn't me. I had a flip phone for years when I started in law enforcement. So
Right.
that's just me. I wouldn't have one now if it wasn't that I need it for this. But I say all that. So I was listening to his show, and what I really loved is I grew up in the church. I grew up in a small rural community. Though we lived in the city, we spent our lives out in the rural community outside of that city. And most of what I've done has always been helping other people, whether it was through ministry at the church, whether it was preaching in nursing homes when I was a teenager. It was always that kind of thing. And I've always also enjoyed writing. That's been a medium that I enjoy, sometimes in the journaling sense, and then also stories and so forth, because it's a way to decompress and something that I find very liberating. So in 2018, when I was hearing his podcast and hearing what he was doing for men, I was like, this message that he's getting out there through this medium is something that law enforcement officers could really use. And at that time, I was teaching at the academy. I still am, but I was teaching at a local law enforcement academy. And I was like, what better way than through something like podcasting to get these messages and get people's stories out? So the monologue show, I do two shows. The monologue show is called Morning Roll Call, comes on Mondays. And then the other one is called The Interview Room. And stories such as yourself, to be able to introduce that to other people and to kind of give them hope for no matter where they are in their lives. Hey, here is someone who's seen failures and seen successes. And if I take some of these ideas and implement them in my life, imagine what a difference it can make. And to be able to do that. So that's kind of what brought me to it. And then I actually went through, he had a little podcasting program. I went through that little 6-week thing to kind of give me some idea what a podcast even was and how you upload it and all these great things that you've been through as well. And you're like, I have no idea what I'm doing here, but after those 6 weeks, I felt a little bit more comfortable. And I also felt very sure that this was something I was supposed to do. And something that I find quite ironic, since then, I've been to a lot of podcast conventions like Podfest and Podcast Movement and so forth. And a common denominator I find with podcasters is a lot of them are introverts.
Isn't that weird?
It is weird. You wouldn't think that people that talk for as much as we do are introverts, but and my personality in a lot of ways is introvertish, even though I can be an extrovert when I need to be, but I found it a medium that was perfect for my personality as well.
So what would you say to our audience as we kind of get close to wrapping up, Wayne? Couple tips for them to pursue that thing they know they should be doing, that when they go to bed at night, it's a recurrent dream. It's in the back of their head of, man, I should be doing this. I could be doing this. What are a couple tips you'd share with them to get them moving in that direction?
Jared, I hate to ask this, but could you repeat that? You got very pixelated and I didn't catch the question.
Of course, it would pixelate right there. That's crazy. Starlink, what are you doing to me? All right. So for our community members out there that are going to bed with the same dream night after night, and it's just gnawing on them that they could be doing something, couple tips on how they can get that first step in that direction. How do they start building momentum towards that?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, especially when you're talking something, whether it's podcasting or that thing that they feel they need to do, or that their purpose that they were put here for. It's cliche, but I would start with, you got to just do it. Right. And my first interview was with my brother, and he worked in law enforcement, which helped. He works in corrections. And so I had him on, and from there, one of the best pieces of advice I got early on was the 80% rule, because I'm naturally a perfectionist. And if I waited for things to be perfect to put them out, I would have done nothing since 2019, except probably type the same thing over and over again. Yeah. So sometimes you have to be willing. Someone had introduced to me what they called the 80% rule. Get it 80% there and then put it out. And that rule has really helped me keep moving forward, whether we're talking the podcast or we're talking writing or we're talking even working with other people, because sometimes we end up in that cycle where we overthink things. Yeah. And we get the paralysis by analysis. And that is my default. I know we've talked before, that's not necessarily yours, but it's by far my default. So for guys like me, if you find yourself there, you definitely need to be willing to take action, get it, 80%. And if you're always, that 1% better every day, you're going to be 100% eventually, but you just got to put in the work and be willing to put yourself out there.
Fantastic. I love it, Wayne. Where can our audience stay connected with you and kind of follow you along your journey?
I really appreciate that. Yeah, we're on pretty much all social media at On the Blue Line Podcast, with the exception of Twitter, which is On the Blue Line and the number 1. But the easiest thing is just go to ontheblueline.com.
Okay, perfect. Wayne, what an honor it was to have you on the show, my friend. I always love our talks, and I have a feeling there'll be more of these in the future.
I'm looking forward to it. Thank you so much, Jared.
And remember, team, life is far too short to live any other way than on purpose. We will see you all again next week.